The morning sun filtered through the oak trees in my backyard as I sat on the wooden deck, watching my golden retriever Max chase squirrels with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age. A year had passed since Martha Henley disappeared from Heritage Hills, and the neighborhood had finally returned to what most people would call normal. No more surprise inspections, no more ridiculous fines for lawn violations, no more fake police patrols making residents feel like criminals in their own homes. But when 8-year-old Tommy Martinez came running over with wide eyes and asked, "Mr. Johnson, did you really shoot down a helicopter?" I realized the story people were telling wasn't quite the truth. Let me introduce you to the cast of characters in this suburban nightmare. There's me, Tom Johnson, a 47-year-old divorced software engineer who just wanted a quiet life with his dog. Then there's Martha Henley, the 43-year-old HOA president who turned our peaceful neighborhood into her personal dictatorship. She commanded a team of 4 fake cops: Jake Morrison, a 35-year-old wannabe tough guy; Rick Thompson, an electrician with delusions of authority; Dave Collins, a dishonorably discharged veteran looking for respect; and Tom Bradley, a mechanic who just needed the extra cash. Supporting players included Pete Morrison, a 70-year-old Vietnam vet who refused to back down; Sarah Williams, a lawyer forced to repaint her house; and Agent Sarah Martinez, the FBI investigator who would eventually bring them all down. This is the story of how a blue plastic chair started a war that ended with federal prison sentences. I was stroking Max's fur when Tommy's question hit me like a cold slap, and I found myself staring up at the clear blue sky where, 14 months ago, the sound of gunfire had shattered the peace of this very spot. In my jacket pocket, I still carried an unopened letter from the FBI, a thank you note from the rescue team that I'd never found the courage to read. The victory had left me feeling hollow in ways I hadn't expected. Sure, Martha was gone, her fake police force disbanded, and the neighborhood was free from her tyrannical rule. But late at night, when Max curled up beside me on the couch, I sometimes wondered if I'd become the very thing I'd fought against. Had I won, or had I just survived? The question haunted me more than I cared to admit. Looking at Tommy's innocent face, I realized that the story he'd heard was probably a twisted version of the truth. "Tommy," I said gently, "I never shot down any helicopter, but there is a story there, and it's not quite what people think." He sat down cross-legged on the grass, clearly settling in for a tale. "It started with a blue plastic chair and a $50 fine," I told him. And as the words left my mouth, I was no longer sitting in the peaceful aftermath. I was back in the nightmare that Heritage Hills had become under Martha Henley's iron-fisted rule. But to understand how we got to helicopters and federal prison, you need to know how it all began. 15 months earlier, life in Heritage Hills was supposed to be the American dream. Manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and property values that made your investment portfolio smile. I'd moved here 3 years ago after my divorce, thinking a quiet suburban life with Max would help me rebuild. The homeowners association seemed reasonable enough at first, just the usual stuff about keeping up appearances and maintaining community standards. Then Martha Henley got elected as president, and everything changed. It started with something so trivial that I almost laugh thinking about it now. I'd left a blue plastic chair on my back patio for 2 days after a rainstorm, letting it dry in the sun. The chair wasn't visible from the street, mind you. It was tucked away in my backyard, where I figured I had some basic privacy rights. Apparently, I was wrong. Martha appeared at my front door on a Tuesday morning, dressed in her trademark navy blazer and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon of mass destruction. "Mr. Johnson," she said in that clipped, authoritative tone that made my skin crawl, "you're in violation of Community Standard 4.7.2 regarding unsightly outdoor furniture." She handed me a citation printed on official-looking letterhead, complete with a $50 fine and a stern warning about future violations. Max, who was usually friendly with everyone, started barking aggressively the moment he saw her through the screen door. It was the first time I'd ever seen him react that way to a human being, and looking back, I should have trusted his instincts. "Ma'am, with all due respect," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "this chair is in my backyard. It's not visible from any public area, and it's my personal property." Martha's smile was as cold as winter rain. "Mr. Johnson, when you signed your HOA agreement, you agreed that all outdoor areas of your property would comply with community standards. The visibility from public areas is irrelevant." She pulled out a laminated card with tiny print that I'd apparently agreed to when I bought the house. "Furthermore," she continued, "failure to comply within 72 hours will result in escalating penalties, up to and including foreclosure proceedings." The word foreclosure hung in the air like a threat, and I realized this wasn't about a plastic chair. This was about power, pure and simple. Martha Henley was 43 years old, recently divorced, and living alone in the largest house at the end of Maple Street. She'd been HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd transformed Heritage Hills from a friendly neighborhood into what residents whispered was a suburban prison. She had her own private security force, 4 men who wore official-looking uniforms and carried badges that looked real enough to fool most people. They called themselves the Heritage Hills Community Protection Unit, and they patrolled the neighborhood with all the authority of actual police officers. Jake Morrison was their leader, a thick-necked former security guard who wore his fake badge like it was a Medal of Honor. Rick Thompson handled the technical aspects, an electrician who'd rigged up official-looking equipment that made their operation seem legitimate. Dave Collins brought military bearing to the group, though his discharge papers told a different story than the one he liked to share. Tom Bradley was the most reluctant member, a decent guy who needed the money Martha paid and didn't fully understand what he'd gotten himself into. Together, they formed Martha's personal army, enforcing rules that grew more ridiculous by the week. The rules under Martha's regime were absurd and constantly changing. You couldn't hang an American flag except on designated holidays, and the flag had to meet specific size requirements outlined in a 12-page document. Your grass couldn't exceed 2.5 inches in height, and they measured it weekly with actual rulers, issuing fines for violations that were often measured in fractions of inches. House paint colors had to be approved by a committee that Martha personally controlled, with a palette so limited that most of the neighborhood looked like a beige and gray prison camp. There was even a quiet hours policy from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. that prohibited any noise louder than a whisper, including dog barking, television audio, and conversations on your own porch. Violations resulted in escalating fines that could reach hundreds of dollars for repeat offenses. The monthly HOA meetings had turned into kangaroo courts where Martha would publicly shame residents for minor infractions while her security team stood guard like enforcers for a mob boss. People started avoiding their neighbors, afraid that any conversation might be reported as a violation. The community lived in genuine fear. Old Pete Morrison, a 70-year-old Vietnam veteran with more combat decorations than most generals, got fined $100 for hanging his POW MIA flag on Memorial Day because it wasn't on Martha's approved list. When he protested at the next HOA meeting, Jake Morrison physically escorted him from the building while Martha watched with obvious satisfaction. Sandra Williams was forced to repaint her entire house because the shade of beige was supposedly inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The paint job cost her $8,000, and when she couldn't afford it immediately, Martha threatened her with daily fines until the work was completed. Sandra ended up taking a second mortgage to pay for paint that looked exactly the same as what she'd had before. Young families started moving away, unable to deal with the constant stress and financial burden of Martha's regime. The Hendersons left after their toddler's birthday party was shut down by the fake police for excessive noise at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. The Patels received daily citations for non-conforming landscaping until they finally gave up and sold their house at a loss. When I refused to pay the plastic chair fine, Martha escalated quickly. She sent me a certified letter threatening to place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings if I didn't comply within 30 days. That's when I realized this wasn't just about arbitrary rules or power trips. This was about something much bigger and more sinister. She was systematically pushing residents to their breaking point, and I was starting to understand why. The final straw came when she issued an official warning to Max for excessive barking during daylight hours when her patrol team walked by. The citation claimed that Max's barking constituted intimidation of community safety officers and warned that repeat violations could result in removal of the offending animal. That night, as I sat in my living room reading the threatening letter about my dog, I realized that I wasn't just fighting a petty tyrant. I was fighting for the soul of our community. And if I didn't take a stand, Martha would continue destroying lives until there was nothing left of the neighborhood I'd moved here to enjoy. The morning of June 15th started like any other, with Max and me enjoying our usual breakfast routine on the back patio. But by 8:30 a.m., everything had gone sideways in a way that would make national news and land half the HOA in federal prison. Max had been acting strange for 2 days, refusing his food and seeming lethargic, but I'd attributed it to the summer heat and his advancing age. When I found him convulsing in the backyard at 7:45 a.m., foam coming from his mouth and his eyes rolled back in his head, I knew immediately that someone had poisoned him. My hands were shaking as I called the emergency veterinary hospital, and when Dr. Rebecca Foster told me that Max's condition was critical and that every minute counted, I made the decision that would change everything. "We have a helicopter service for critical cases," Dr. Foster said over the phone while I cradled Max's barely breathing body. "If you can provide a safe landing zone, we can have a medical team to you in 20 minutes. I looked at my backyard, which was the only open space large enough for a helicopter in the immediate area, and gave her my address without hesitation. The sound of rotor blades approaching Heritage Hills was like nothing the neighborhood had ever heard. Max was convulsing again, blood seeping from his mouth, when Martha appeared at my back gate with her entire fake police force in tow. She was dressed in her usual power suit, but today she had the addition of what looked like an official badge pinned to her lapel. Jake Morrison led the charge, wearing a uniform that looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. The dark blue shirt had patches that read Community Protection and Heritage Hills Security, and his badge caught the morning sunlight like it was made of real gold instead of cheap metal. Rick Thompson flanked him, carrying what appeared to be official law enforcement equipment, including handcuffs, a radio, and what looked like a service weapon holstered at his side. "You do not have permission to land aircraft in this residential area," Martha shouted over the increasing noise of the rotors, her face red with anger and authority. Behind her stood Dave Collins, his military bearing evident despite his dishonorable discharge, and Tom Bradley, who looked uncomfortable but unwilling to abandon his teammates. They formed a semicircle around my yard like they were preparing to arrest someone. The helicopter pilot could see the situation developing below. Through the aircraft's external speakers, his voice crackled with professional concern. "Ground personnel, please clear the landing zone. This is a medical emergency, and we need immediate access to the patient." But Martha wasn't backing down. She'd built her entire power structure on the principle that she controlled everything that happened in Heritage Hills. "This is a medical emergency," I yelled back, cradling Max as blood continued to seep from his mouth and his breathing became more labored. "This is a rescue helicopter, not a joyride. My dog is dying, and these people are trying to save his life." But Martha's expression only hardened. She'd crossed too many lines to back down now, and admitting that she was wrong would undermine everything she'd built. "I don't care if your dog is dying," Martha screamed, her mask of authority slipping to reveal the cruelty underneath. "You do not have the right to bring unauthorized aircraft into this community without proper permits and approval from the HOA board." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on what I could now see was definitely a weapon of some kind. The confrontation escalated quickly when Jake pulled out what looked like a service weapon and pointed it at the helicopter, which was now hovering about 15 feet above my yard. "This is an unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace," he shouted into a bullhorn that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "You are ordered to depart immediately or face arrest for trespassing on private property." The pilot, seeing what appeared to be armed law enforcement officers threatening his aircraft, immediately began gaining altitude while radioing for backup. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Medflight 772. We have armed personnel on the ground threatening our aircraft during a medical emergency, requesting immediate police assistance at Heritage Hills residential community." That's when Rick Thompson made the decision that would eventually send them all to federal prison. Whether caught up in the moment or following some predetermined plan, he fired what I later learned was pepper spray from a device that looked remarkably like a real gun. The orange cloud missed the helicopter, but created enough of a visual obstruction that the pilot had to abort the landing for safety reasons. "You're interfering with a medical emergency," I screamed at Martha, but she was beyond reason now. "This is a private residential community," she yelled back as the helicopter circled overhead. "And you people have no jurisdiction here. We are the legal authority in Heritage Hills, and we're ordering you to leave immediately." The real police arrived within minutes, responding to the pilot's distress call about armed individuals threatening a medical helicopter. When Sergeant Michael Torres and Officer Jennifer Walsh pulled up in their patrol car, they found Martha's fake cops still pointing weapons at the circling aircraft, while I held my dying dog and pleaded for sanity. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Torres asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon when he saw Jake Morrison's drawn gun. That's when the whole charade started to unravel. Jake's weapon turned out to be a realistic toy that would fool most people from a distance, but not a trained police officer up close. Rick Thompson's pepper spray device was legal to own, but illegal to use against aircraft, and his fake police badge was a clear violation of state laws regarding impersonation of law enforcement officers. Dave Collins had an outstanding warrant for unpaid child support, and Tom Bradley immediately started trying to distance himself from the others when he realized how serious the situation had become. The helicopter had to land in the public park 2 blocks away, and those extra minutes nearly cost Max his life. By the time I got him to the emergency team, he was barely clinging to consciousness. Dr. Foster and her team worked on him for over an hour, pumping his stomach and administering medications to counteract what turned out to be a massive dose of rat poison. As I sat in the veterinary hospital waiting room, watching news crews arrive to cover the story of a fake police force that had fired on a rescue helicopter, I realized that this was no longer about HOA rules or neighborhood disputes. This was about fundamental questions of right and wrong, and Martha had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The local news ran the story that evening with the headline, "HOA fake police fire on medical helicopter," and by the next morning it had gone viral on social media. Videos shot by neighbors showed Martha's security team pointing weapons at the helicopter while I held my dying dog, and the public reaction was swift and brutal. That night, as I sat beside Max's recovery cage in the emergency veterinary clinic, I made a decision that would define the rest of this story. I was done being the victim in Martha Henley's power fantasy. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. But it would be fought on my terms, with my weapons, the truth, the law, and the kind of patient, methodical planning that she would never see coming. In the days following the helicopter incident, I went completely silent. No more arguing at HOA meetings, no more confrontations with Martha's security team, no more public displays of anger or frustration. To the outside world, it looked like I'd been broken by the experience, traumatized into submission by the realization of how far Martha was willing to go. The truth was exactly the opposite. I was using the silence to plan, to research, and to build a case that would bring down not just Martha, but the entire corrupt system she'd built. The first person I contacted was Sarah Williams, the lawyer who'd been forced to repaint her house under Martha's ridiculous color restrictions. Sarah specialized in real estate law, and she'd been quietly documenting HOA violations for months, waiting for the right moment to strike back. When I told her about my suspicions regarding Martha's ultimate motives, she immediately understood the bigger picture. This wasn't about controlling the neighborhood for its own sake. This was about driving down property values and forcing residents to sell their homes at below-market prices. Sarah's investigation revealed the scope of Martha's scheme. Pinnacle Development Group had been quietly approaching residents with low-ball offers for their properties, always coming just after some expensive HOA violation or harassment from the fake police force. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and when Sarah dug deeper into public records, she found that Martha had been receiving consulting fees from Pinnacle for the past 2 years. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Terrorize the residents until they wanted to leave, then swoop in with cash offers that seemed like salvation. We started building our evidence carefully and methodically. Old Pete Morrison, the Vietnam veteran, turned out to have some investigative skills from his military days. Sandra Williams, the woman who'd been forced to repaint her house, was a retired accountant who knew how to trace financial irregularities. Even Jake Morrison, one of Martha's fake cops, approached me quietly after the helicopter incident to express his concerns about how far things were going. He thought he was signing up for legitimate community security work, not intimidating residents and firing on rescue aircraft. The key breakthrough came when Sarah managed to access the HOA's security camera system using old passwords that hadn't been changed since before Martha's reign began. The footage revealed Martha's late-night meetings with Pinnacle executives, along with recorded conversations about their strategy for encouraging voluntary relocations. We also found evidence that Martha had been skimming money from the HOA's maintenance fund to pay her security team, which constituted embezzlement of community funds. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. While reviewing veterinary records for Max's poisoning case, we discovered that Martha had purchased large quantities of rat poison from a local hardware store just days before Max became sick. The store's security footage showed her making the purchase, and when we tested soil samples from my backyard, we found traces of the same poison. Martha hadn't just been harassing residents. She'd been attempting to murder their pets as psychological warfare. As we gathered evidence, I started planning the endgame. We needed Martha to incriminate herself beyond any shadow of doubt, and that meant getting her to admit her crimes on record. Sarah suggested that we use the next HOA meeting as our stage, but I had a different idea. Martha's greatest weakness was her ego and her need to control everything around her. If I could make her think she'd won, if I could convince her that I'd been beaten into submission, she might let her guard down enough to reveal the full scope of her operations. The plan was risky, but it was also elegant in its simplicity. I would publicly apologize to Martha, pay all my fines, and ask to be included in her inner circle as a reformed community member. Once I had access to her confidence and her private meetings, I could gather the kind of evidence that would not only convict her, but also expose the entire conspiracy. It would require me to swallow my pride and pretend to be something I wasn't. But after what she'd done to Max and to our community, I was willing to do whatever it took to bring her down. 2 weeks after the helicopter incident, I showed up to the monthly HOA meeting with my head hung low and a cashier's check for all outstanding fines in my hand. The community center was packed with residents who'd come to see how the drama would play out. and Martha sat at the head table like a queen holding court. When I approached the microphone during the public comment period, you could hear a pin drop in the room. "I want to apologize to President Henley and to this community," I said, my voice deliberately subdued and defeated. "I let my emotions get the better of me, and I put people at risk with my selfishness." Martha's expression shifted from suspicion to satisfaction as I continued my performance. "I'm here tonight to pay all my fines in full and to request that I be allowed to contribute positively to this community going forward." I held up the check for everyone to see, and the murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Some residents looked disappointed, thinking I'd given up the fight. Others seemed relieved that the conflict might finally be over. But Martha was practically glowing with triumph, and I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. After the meeting, Martha approached me in the parking lot with what she probably thought was a magnanimous gesture. "Tom," she said, using my first name for the first time since I'd known her, "I appreciate your willingness to admit your mistakes. This community needs residents who understand the importance of order and cooperation." She paused, studying my face for any sign of deception, then made the offer I'd been hoping for. "I'm forming a special committee to help with community security initiatives. If you're serious about contributing, perhaps you'd be interested in joining." Over the next 3 weeks, I attended Martha's inner circle meetings as her newest convert. The discussions were even more disturbing than I'd imagined. Martha openly discussed which residents were problems that needed to be addressed, and she had detailed plans for forcing out families who wouldn't cooperate with her vision. She showed me financial projections for the Pinnacle development deal, which would net her personally over $2 million once all the properties were acquired. She even laughed about the helicopter incident, calling it exactly the kind of dramatic nonsense that makes people want to move somewhere quieter. But the most chilling revelation came during a late-night planning session in Martha's home office. She had detailed psychological profiles of every resident in Heritage Hills, complete with information about their jobs, their family situations, their financial vulnerabilities, and their personal fears. She knew exactly which pressure points to apply to each person, and she'd been systematically working through her list of targets. My own file was extensive, including information about my divorce, my job performance, and even Max's veterinary records. The trap I set was simple but effective. I suggested that Martha formalize her security team's authority by having them officially deputized as community safety officers. I drafted a document that would give her fake cops legal standing to make citizens' arrests and carry weapons on HOA property. What Martha didn't realize was that signing such a document would transform their impersonation of police officers from a misdemeanor into a federal felony. She signed it without hesitation, so confident in her control that she didn't bother to have a lawyer review the paperwork. During our last meeting before the final HOA gathering, Martha revealed the next phase of her plan. Pete Morrison's house was going to suffer an accidental electrical fire that would force him to sell to cover the insurance deductible. Sandra Williams was going to receive a surprise inspection that would reveal dangerous code violations requiring expensive remediation. And my own property was scheduled for a random break-in that would demonstrate the need for increased security measures and higher HOA fees. As I sat in that meeting, recording every word on a device hidden in my jacket, I realized that Martha had moved far beyond simple fraud or harassment. She was planning actual crimes against her neighbors, and she was doing it with the casual indifference of someone who'd convinced herself that her victims deserved whatever happened to them. When she walked me to the door that night, she put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Tom, I'm glad you finally understand how things work around here. Tomorrow's meeting should be very interesting." I went home that night knowing that I had everything I needed to destroy her, but also knowing that I'd had to compromise pieces of my own soul to get it. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was airtight, and justice was finally within reach. But as I sat on my back patio with Max sleeping peacefully beside me, I wondered if I had become someone I could still recognize in the mirror. The final act was scheduled for the next evening, and after tomorrow night, nothing in Heritage Hills would ever be the same again. The final HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in late July, with the community center packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was going to happen, though nobody knew exactly what. Martha presided over the meeting with her usual authoritarian confidence, announcing a special presentation about the future development of Heritage Hills. She had charts and projections showing how the community could benefit from strategic partnerships with local developers, and she spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who believed she'd already won. I sat in the back row as planned, with Max lying quietly at my feet and my hands folded in my lap like a reformed troublemaker who'd learned his place. At exactly 7:30 p.m., just as Martha was reaching the climax of her presentation about the wonderful opportunities that awaited our community, FBI agent Sarah Martinez walked through the main doors of the community center. She was followed by 2 local police officers and a federal prosecutor, and the sudden silence in the room was so complete that you could hear the air conditioning humming. "Martha Henley," Agent Martinez said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried to every corner of the room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, impersonation of law enforcement officers, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted arson." The color drained from Martha's face as the charges continued, each one more damaging than the last. "You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll have plenty to say once you understand the evidence we have against you." Martha's first instinct was to deflect blame, which was exactly what I'd expected. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic and desperation. "Tom Johnson has been orchestrating some kind of vendetta against me. This is all fabricated evidence and conspiracy theories." She pointed directly at me, her finger shaking with rage, but Agent Martinez calmly shook her head. "Mr. Johnson has been working with us for several weeks, Mrs. Henley. The evidence we have includes recordings of your own voice detailing your criminal conspiracy. The evidence was presented methodically and devastatingly. Video footage of Martha directing her fake police force to fire on the rescue helicopter. Audio recordings of her admitting to the Pinnacle Development conspiracy and her plans to force residents from their homes. Financial records showing embezzlement from HOA funds and payments from the development company. Even security camera footage of her purchasing the rat poison that had nearly killed Max. With each piece of evidence, more residents in the audience gasped or shook their heads in disbelief. the fake police force was arrested simultaneously at their homes. Jake Morrison received 2 years in federal prison for impersonating a law enforcement officer. Rick Thompson got 3 years for assault with what the prosecutor called a simulated deadly weapon. Dave Collins, who had a prior criminal record, received 5 years for conspiracy and multiple violations of his probation. Tom Bradley, who cooperated with the investigation and provided additional evidence, received 1 year of supervised probation and community service. Martha's sentence was the most severe: 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, with additional charges for embezzlement, assault, and animal cruelty. All of her assets were seized to provide restitution to the residents she'd victimized, and the Pinnacle development deal was permanently canceled. The FBI investigation expanded to include 12 other HOA communities where similar schemes had been attempted, leading to a nationwide crackdown on what prosecutors called the largest residential fraud conspiracy in recent history. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came not from Martha's arrest, but from the reaction of the community. Pete Morrison stood up and began applauding, his weathered hands coming together with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who'd waited years for justice. Sandra Williams wiped tears from her eyes, finally free from the fear that had dominated her life for so long. One by one, the entire room joined in the applause, not for me, but for the simple fact that their nightmare was finally over. The twist that I hadn't expected came later, when I was reviewing the documents seized from Martha's office. Hidden among her files was evidence of similar operations in over 20 communities across 3 states, all coordinated by a network of corrupt HOA officials and unscrupulous developers. The FBI estimated that hundreds of families had been victimized by variations of Martha's scheme, and the investigation would continue for years to come. As I sat in my backyard the next morning, watching Max chase his tennis ball with renewed energy, I felt the complex emotions that come with winning a war you never wanted to fight. The community was free, justice had been served, and the criminals were facing appropriate consequences. But I also knew that I'd changed during the process, that some part of my faith in basic human decency had been permanently damaged by what I'd witnessed. When the FBI offered me the position of interim HOA president, I politely declined. I'd seen too much of what power could do to people, and I wasn't sure I trusted myself not to become another version of what we just defeated. Instead, I suggested that the community operate without a formal HOA structure for a while, giving everyone time to heal and figure out what kind of neighborhood they really wanted to live in. The story ends where it began, with me and Max in our backyard, watching the sky and remembering the sound of helicopter rotors. When young Tommy asked me about shooting down aircraft, I told him the truth. That sometimes protecting what's right requires fighting battles you never wanted to fight, and that real victory isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about making sure they can't hurt anyone else ever again. As for whether I became the hero or the villain in this story, well, that's a question I'm still trying to answer. 3 months after Martha's conviction, Heritage Hills held its first community barbecue in over 5 years. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months were sharing stories and laughing together. Pete Morrison flew his POW MIA flag with pride and Sandra Williams painted her house a brilliant shade of yellow that would have given Martha an aneurysm. Max, fully recovered from his poisoning, became the unofficial neighborhood mascot, beloved by children and adults alike. I still think about Martha sometimes, wondering what drove her to such extremes of control and cruelty. Was it the divorce that broke something inside her? Was it the intoxicating nature of unchecked power? Or was there always something dark lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? I suppose I'll never know, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that she can't hurt anyone anymore, and that our community learned something valuable about the difference between order and oppression. The lesson I took from the whole experience is that evil often comes disguised as authority, wrapped in official-looking documents, and enforced by people who convince themselves they're maintaining standards. It thrives in silence and grows stronger when good people choose to look the other way. Sometimes fighting back requires becoming someone you don't entirely recognize. But the alternative, letting bullies and tyrants run unchecked, is infinitely worse. As I finish this story, Max is sleeping peacefully in the shade of our oak tree, and the afternoon sun is casting long shadows across a neighborhood that finally feels like home again. The sky is clear and blue, with no helicopters in sight, and that's exactly how we like it.